Director of Wharton Center for Human Resources. In today's session, Dr. Capelli will be talking with us about the emerging model for HR leaders, and we'll be discussing things in HR that we should drop off our radars and other items that we should refocus on. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Capelli. And I need a clicker. If somebody's got it back there, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll be doing puppet shows like this for a while, which won't go so well. Folks, welcome. I appreciate you hanging with us. We're going to be brief here. I had a colleague who gave a talk recently. Afterwards, he checked with the audience and said, and asked, how did it go? And one of his colleagues said, well, you were brief. And he said, thank you. And he said, that's great, because I didn't want to bore people. And his colleague said, oh, no, you were boring as well. Right? So I promise to be brief. I can't promise about being boring. Here's what we're going to talk about. If we get my slide back up there. Oops. Okay. We're going to talk about how to make human resources as a functional area more influential, how to raise the status of it a bit. If you're in HR, you're a practitioner, it's very important for you. If you're somebody who is trying to help your clients, HR clients, become more influential, it's about opportunities as well, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. We hear all these things, right? People are our most important asset. Human capital is the only differentiator. But I think really not everybody believes that inside the organizations. Have you seen is it a Dilbert cartoon that says, we used to believe people are our most important asset? He said, we were wrong. Money is our most important asset, which is probably right. Why is there so much hate around the HR function? And I think, frankly, there's a bit of it. So let's see if we can move this up. Have you seen some of these reports here? You may have seen this one in the Harvard Business Review. And by the way, what I'm going to talk about today is an article I've written for the Harvard Business Review in rebuttal to Ram's piece. Ram's piece came out in 2014 saying we ought to blow up human resources, move out the stuff which is administrative, just focus on talent. What you may have seen, those of you who are older, is this article from Fast Company. You remember this? How many folks remember this article? Old enough to remember this? Everybody, I'm sure, sent you a copy of it along the way, right? If you're a little older, you may remember this one as well. That's our next one here. This was from Fortune. Tom Stewart wrote this article. You remember this one? Anybody old enough to remember this one in Fortune? Now, what you don't know, probably, I don't think anybody here is old enough to remember the 1930 Fortune article, which basically said the same thing as the 1996 article and the 2005 article and the 2014 article, right? And that is, it's line managers complaining about human resources, right? We'll come back to this in just a second, but one of the things we want to recognize out of this is it's not necessarily a news story, okay? In the 1950s and 1960s, which functional area, according to Survey of Executives, was rated the most glamorous? What do you think? You can just shout out an answer here. What do you think? Glamour, 1950s, 1960s, influential glamour, what? Marketing, yeah, you're thinking Mad Men, right? Yeah. Advertising in general, yeah. Anybody else want to take a shot? Engineering. Glamour? Engineer? Yeah, maybe. It's a little difficult to believe, but it was human resources. And you might ask yourself, how could it be that human resources was the most glamorous? Because in the 1950s, if you could remember back then, to your knowledge of the 1950s, not many people here remember it, this was a period of lifetime employment, long-term corporate careers, and the HR guys controlled everything about your career. And there was somebody in HR, some people called him the chess master, who determined whether you went to Paris on an assignment or you went to Sheboygan, right? And those guys had enormous power, right? All their jokes were funny. They never had to buy a drink. These guys, everybody was sucking up to these guys. They controlled all the important stuff. And that is going to be a hint to the general story about how do you get influence, you control the important stuff. You deal with the important problems, and you get control of them, right? This one is a little more recent. Let's see if I can get this one going. In the late 1990s, during the dot-com boom and all that sort of stuff, the hottest job in the United States, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, was, what do you think? Corporate recruiter was the hottest job, right? It wasn't an IT job. It was the people finding the IT people. That was the hottest job. We don't recall that. We don't remember it, but that was true, right? So here's a way to think about all this stuff, right? There's a consistent problem that human resources has, right? And the consistent problem is this one. We are, in human resources, always telling managers and executives things that they don't particularly want to hear, right? Does any of this sound familiar to you? You can't hit on the young staffers, right? How often in human resources have you had to have that conversation with somebody in the management ranks? They don't want to hear that, right? Not all your jokes are appropriate, even if you think they're funny, right? And the thing about these kinds of admonitions is they go all the way to the top of the organization. These are things which are important for the organization to do, but people don't necessarily want to hear them. You've got to talk to your subordinates about their performance. I don't want to do that, right? And you've got to talk to them about their development. I don't want to do that either, right? And the last one, which you probably hear a lot too, but you could generate your own list of these, I'm sure, is you can't hire this person just because you really like them, right? They have to fit certain qualifications. They got to fit the job requirement, all that kind of stuff. Line management doesn't really like that stuff. Okay? So that is a persistent problem. There's not very much we can do about that, except for one thing, and we'll come back to that one thing in a minute. And here's the cyclical problem. Why are people complaining about HR in 1930? Why were they complaining about it in the mid-1990s? Why were they complaining about it in 2004 or 5? Why are they complaining about it now in 2014? What do you think? Anything strike you about that? And why was HR powerful in the 1950s and 60s and, corporate recruiter in 2000 was the top job in the US? What's going on there that influences HR's power? Up and down. It's the business cycle, right? And what's going on in 1930, right? Well, in the 1920s, things were booming, and we started to realize that managers and supervisors in particular could really make things bad. In the first of the big assembly lines of the Ford Motor Company, and apologies if you've heard me tell this story before. Anybody know what turnover was at the Ford Motor Company in 1913? Ford, one of the best employers in the city of Detroit. Anybody know what turnover was then? I should say it was a pretty typical turnover number. Want to guess what it was? It's a dark room. You can just shout it out. Nobody will know. What do you think? 5%. 5%? Yeah. Anybody else? 12%. Woo. A little off, 320%. Was the turnover rate at Ford Motor Company. And at most companies in those days, people just churned in and out. You kept a few skilled workers, but you had a bunch of unskilled people every day just coming in and out. The biggest manufacturing operation in the world was right outside what is now City Hall Plaza here in Philadelphia, right? That way. And here's how they used to hire people. It was the Baldwin Locomotive Works, where they built train engines. They would go to the gates of the factory, and I'd look around first. I'd go into work. I'm a supervisor. I'm short 5 people. I'd go to the gates of the factory, and I'd throw 5 apples into the crowd, and if you caught an apple, you came to work for me. Right? Those of you in the search business, wouldn't that be simpler? Although it has adverse impact against short people. Very good. Adverse impact against short people. That's true. Ford Motor Company decided to run a little experiment. One of their engineers had the idea that maybe the problems they were having with their cars were related to turnover. They were having a real problem getting the assembly line to work. So they ran an experiment, and here's what they did. The first thing they did is exit interviews of the people who were quitting. This is like 1914, right? And what do you think they found? What were the employees saying for the reasons they quit? What do you think? Let me give you a hint. Same thing they say now. I hate my boss. So Ford Motor Company put in place modern people managers, people trained basically to not be jerks, right? And that movement cut the turnover at Ford from about 350% to 50%. They also doubled the pay. Henry Ford's famous $5 a day plan, have you heard of that one? Does that ring a bell? Where he said, I want to pay my workers enough so they can afford to buy my cars. You probably heard of that, right? That's not why he did it. That's why his PR people told the audience, the world, that he did it. The real reason he did it was to cut turnover, and it worked like a charm. That in the exit interviews, that in getting rid of the bad managers, right? So that was the kind of direction things were going. What happens in 1929, 1930? The Great Depression hits. And the line managers discover that you can treat the employees however the hell you want, and they're not quitting, right? And so they start to say, what do we need these professional people managers for? So that's why in Fortune in 1930, line managers are bitching about human resources, right? Why does it happen again in 1990, mid-1990s? We're coming out of a little recession in the early 1990s. And people are saying, well, what do we need this for? Why does it come again in 2004, 2003, after the 2002 recession, 2001 recession? Why do we hear it in 2014? We're still lagging in the economy from the second worst downturn in modern times, right? When the economy goes down, line managers say, why do we need HR people around? Because our employees are not quitting. It's pretty easy to hire people. They're all behaving. I can do what I want. Thank you very much. It doesn't matter. As soon as the economy started to tighten in 1950, 1960, there was a mad scramble for talent. It's unlike any of the things we're seeing now, right? It was really hard to find college-educated people. It was really hard to find people who had the right ability. They're trying to hire you for a lifetime. Corporate recruiting was a huge deal. HR was powerful. Right? So once you tackle the problems that are powerful to the company, you get power and influence, right? When you don't, when the problems go away, we got a problem, right? So we got one more problem here, I think, and that is something that has happened since the early 1980s, when new people started to take charge of the corporations. We'll talk about this in a minute, more financially oriented people, and they started to pull back on the HR programs that had been in place for generations. Things like, for example, through the 1970s, in large corporations, your supervisor was held accountable in big corporations for the performance appraisals and the quality of appraisals they did for you. Your supervisor was held accountable for the developmental experiences they gave you and the kinds of conversations they had with you. If you looked at the CEO's calendar in the 1970s, you know what the number one item was? More time on this than any other single item. Talent reviews. More time spent on talent reviews by the CEO in the 1970s than any other task they performed, right? The CEO's more financial orientation start backing off on that stuff. They don't require this as part of your own assessment, how well you did the appraisals of your subordinates. We don't require you to give developmental assignments. We don't hold you accountable for it. We hold you accountable for being an individual contributor. And HR is in the position now of chasing line managers and trying to make them do these things, right? I was at Capgemini's headquarters a little while ago. A guy in charge of global talent there named Will Peachy did something very interesting for a meeting they had of all their HR leaders. He had a little debate in the room. And the debate was this. This side of the room argues that what HR is doing in things like this, that is pleading with managers to give developmental assignments, pleading with them to do the right thing in terms of performance appraisals and have serious conversations. Doing all that stuff was making it worse because basically it was like putting a Band-Aid on a problem, right? But in the consequence of that is it's making everybody hate human resources because they're nagging them all the time. The other side of the room was arguing, no, we got to do this or things would just be a complete mess. And the debate was pretty tense. And it wasn't clear who was going to win at the end. But remember, these are HR people. And at least half of them were arguing that what we're doing is just making things worse, right? And at the end of the day, they concluded that They better do this anyway, because otherwise things would be a disaster in the organization. But there's a cost to this for human resources. And the cost is we are often seen as the group that's nagging you as line leaders to do things you don't want to do. And so I think one of the things we're going to have to worry about is how many of these tasks in HR you want to be taking on. And that is things where we're trying to persuade line managers. We don't have authority to make them do it. We're trying to persuade them to do things that are good for the workers, good for the organization, but they don't have to do it, right? Because that puts us in the role of nags. And you start burning up your social capital the more you do that. So let me cut to the chase, and then I want to hear what you guys sort of think here. There's one more intractable problem that we have in human resources, and that is the way particularly public companies are run these days. Human resources, by definition, is a long-term play, right? The kinds of things that we do pay off in the long run. At least a lot of them pay off in the long run. And we're in a world where U.S. business in particular has an incredibly short-term focus. This isn't true around the world. And by the way, I've looked at this in a bunch of different companies. The best, most sophisticated HR systems in the world right now are in India. If you get the chance to work for an Indian company, I think you should take it very seriously, because they take human resources really seriously. The most powerful function in India is human resources. Why is that? Because they got massive talent problems, and they are set out to address them. And they're doing a good job of addressing them, and their power is high, right? The problem we've got in the U.S. is we got business leaders who have an incredibly short view of success, quarterly by quarterly, and many of the things we're doing in HR span longer-term horizons, and that is a big problem. One of the ways around this problem is to try to get more financially oriented in order to deal with these guys who are running the companies, and that is the language of business now. This is nothing new, right? This is nothing new. You guys have all lived through this, but it is a very different situation. People running corporations today, it used to be 20 years ago that the most common path to the top of the executive ranks, and we published some articles on this in the Harvard Business Review if you want to see it, was through marketing. Now, in the last 20 years, it's been clearly through finance, right? And many of the people who run large corporations now have come straight through the finance function. They have no line experience. They often have no functional experience other than through that functional area. Those of you who were at dinner the first night remember Jana's story, Jana Torsone, who won the Lifetime Achievement Award, listening to a CFO complain about how awful human resources was, and her response to that guy, well, I could see why human resources must be bad in your company, because I can't imagine any good HR person wanting to work for you. But I think it's an issue that CFO-type folks don't know much of anything about human resources, and unless we educate them, we got a problem, okay? So let's talk in the end here about what are the takeaways. So what should we do in order to raise, however good you think your position is in your current organization, how do we make it better? And the first thing to do, I believe, but I want you to tell me in just a second here, is not take on any more tasks where you have responsibility but you don't have authority. And this is if you find yourself pleading with managers and trying to persuade and influence them to do the right stuff, that burns up your social capital. And you can't take on too many of those, right? Because it is burning up your reputation to have to do this. Now, sometimes maybe you can convert these to real things that you can really assess people on and you can hold them accountable for. Here's a great example from a colleague who ran human resources in England at the BBC. He said he was given the task of trying to get the executives of the BBC to cut down the excessive number of first-class flights they were using on airplanes. Okay? They were allowed to travel first class if it was at the last minute or there was no economy flights available. So he found himself nagging these guys, you know, please don't do this, please be more responsible. And how much effect do you think he had? None. Except that everybody was hating him for nagging him, right? He did one very simple intervention. Every month after this period of time, he decided to post the names rank order of the top 10 people who flew the most first-class flights, right? After that, first-class travel plummeted, right? He found a way to try to hold people accountable for it, even though the top executives of the company were not letting him be accountable for this, not giving him the responsibility to make people do it. He found a way to push them to make them do it, right? Tasks which are not going to work for us very well. I mean, I must say, you can tell why I don't get invited to many HR parties. I'm no fan of this idea that the millennials are anything special. Let me tell you what I know about this. You look at the data. There's no evidence whatsoever from demographics that there is a group called millennials. Here's how that stuff got going. It got going as follows, and if you study the world of demography, you won't see a single article or a single demographer making any claim that there's a millennial or a Gen X group or any of those things. And it's a simple methodological mistake that drove this whole thing. Here's the mistake. Inside your organization, you could survey your employees, and you'll find young people act differently than people who are 30, who act differently than people who are 40. In demography, there's a distinction between what are known as age effects. That means things that change as you get older, and cohort effects. That is, you're born at a period where something so big and powerful happens to you and your classmates that it sears you and you can see it in you for the rest of your life. Like being raised in the Great Depression or in another country being raised in a war, that is a searing experience that creates a generation. Well, here's what happens. You remember, how many of us are baby boomers in the room? Just raise your hands. We are now called the workaholic generation. Do you remember what our parents said about us? We were the laziest, most ungrateful generation. We were unkept. I mean, you name it, right? What happened to us? We got older, that's all, right? When you're 22, what's your big priority that you could look back on when you were 22 and you could say in mixed company? What was your big priority? When you're 22 years old, what was it? Fun, social life, dating, parties, that kind of stuff. Once you get about 28, what happens to that priority? How did some of you feel this morning after drinking all last night? It starts to get harder to do. Then many people get married or they get in committed relationship. What happens to that fun priority then, the partying priority? Boom, right? The next thing that happens is you buy a house, right? And then the mortgage guy comes every month for that, and the idea that you're going to drop everything and go to Tahiti, that goes out the door. And then the next thing that happens after that is you get kids, and what happens then? Your life is over. Yes, over. What happens then? You need money, you need stability, you need to get a promotion. Those are age effects. They happen to every generation, every country, you see the same thing. What happens in terms of all this millennial stuff is that you survey the 22-year-olds, and they say, what are they interested in? Fun, networking, all that kind of stuff. Those millennials, they're like that. It's not because they're millennials, it's because they're 22, that's why. And they're not going to be like that when they're 30, and they're not going to be like that when they're 50. They're going to change in predictable ways. Now, here's my point about this. Do you really want to spend a lot of time worrying about millennials, or Gen X, or Gen Y? What are you going to do about it? Do we think we're really going to persuade our managers to change the organization to accommodate this group of people? Because they're not going to be like this for long, by the way. It does matter a lot to know how to manage young people, but it's a fool's errand to try to get your organization to change the way it operates just for this group of kids who are coming along now. And here's the other thing about it, even if you thought there was a generation difference, this variation in this population is huge, right? In any group, any age group, you know, like coming into the workforce now at 22, it's about 17 million people, right? In that 17 million, you see conservatives, you see liberals, you see pro-ecology people, you see anti-ecology people. Just hire the ones that fit you. Don't worry about what the average effect is. So what about the average effect? You're only hiring 30 people out of a population of 17 million. Just find the ones that fit you. So in my view, this is a great example of burning up your social capital, right? You're persuading people to try to do something. You don't have any authority to make them do it. To manage people differently in a way which is probably not even going to work in the long term. Right? Here's the second thing. It's important for HR to have a point of view about everything associated with HR. Here's the example. If you go to most companies now, you find that the way they hire is a very old-fashioned way. They still do a lot of unstructured interviews, which we've known for literally 100 years don't work, right? Why do we still do that? Well, it's because nobody's willing to raise their hand and tell the top guys who like this approach that, in fact, the evidence overwhelmingly shows it doesn't work, right? We see companies, for example, that have wellness programs introduced because their CEO just had a serious health problem. Or they have women's initiative because their daughter of the CEO started working in the workplace, right? That's what's driving all their behavior, and HR is not saying anything. There was a very telling statistic in a survey done a couple of years ago. At the beginning of the Great Recession, only 30% of HR function leaders reported they were consulted on the decisions to lay off employees. That is the initial decision that said, we got to lay off this many people. Only a third. I mean, it's astonishing when you think about it, right? That means, I think to me anyway, somebody is not raising their hand and saying, you know, we got a point of view on this. Here's what the evidence says we ought to do, or how the evidence says we ought to do it. Okay? The third thing is the big data train, which is certainly coming, and here's the reason you better get ahead of this, is because there's another function inside your organizations that is already on that train, and that's the CIO group. They've got the people who know how to use the data, they've got the computers, they got the programmers, and they're all over these questions in many organizations all over. And if you're not on that train, think about the problem. You've now got the CIO people who are giving the top executives advice on HR practices. If that happens, I think you're in big trouble in terms of your influence, right? And the last one here, I think, is to develop more of a project focus. The idea of trying to map HR onto strategy, you may remember that discussion. It used to be a very big deal. The problem is most companies don't have any long-term strategy. They've got a series of maybe year-by-year projects they work on. They've got a very short-term orientation. And the goal of HR, I think, now is to fit onto those projects that their companies are trying to do. Forget about long-term strategy, because the companies don't have them. And when they have them, they change them all the time. So project by project, business leader by business leader, what can we do to support that particular project in that particular spot? We got just a minute here, but you can already see why I don't get invited to many more HR parties after this, because there's something to annoy virtually everybody here, but I have tenure, so I can say whatever I want, and I'm also not selling anything. So let me ask you guys, what do you think? What would be useful if you had your magic wand to raise the status of HR, however valuable you think you are now, could always go higher, right? So what do you think? What would raise it if your magic wand? Anybody want to take a shot at this? Anybody that I've provoked, for example, want to say something about this? Or something that you've done or you've seen that you think raise the status, or things that you think you've seen that have actually hurt the function in terms of its status and influence? You buy my list before? You know, in Philadelphia, we have this expression of Quaker consensus. You know what this is? Nobody says anything, so I'm assuming you all agree with me, which is probably not true. Anybody want to take a shot at this? We've got about one more minute. Results? What about results? Yeah. Yeah. So, and let me suggest that if you don't even have to do that, because that is very, very difficult. And in the world of business school research, where every area is trying to show how marketing affects shareholder value and how, you know, operations affect shareholder value, it is almost impossible to find effects between any of those practices and shareholder value. And the reason is the chain is too long. You can make all those results go away. All you have to do is show our practices have effects on something intermediate. It cuts cost. It cuts turnover. It improves retention of clients. Something small is good enough, right? Good enough. One more thought. Yeah.
So just to piggyback on that concept, an answer to the question, what would raise HR influence?
Yep.
Is to just change the language from defining HR as a cost center
Yeah.
to a revenue generating center.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What I realize is, you know, the finance world has defined us as a liability.
I think that's exactly right.
And until we change
Right.
the concept, which starts often first with the language that we generate we do to enable people
Yep.
to be their best.
Yep. Yeah.
That's the mind shift.
I think that's great. It's absolutely right. The CFOs have a cost focus, and if you've got a budget that's got only costs and you show no benefits on the other side, no benefits in dollar terms, they're going to manage you down to zero, because that's what they do, right? Speaking of managing down to zero, I know you're all pretty hungry, and I think we've run over our time, and lunch now is... You're going to tell us. Folks, thank you very much for your time. I better get off the stage here and let you go to lunch.